Titus. I'm the director of the University of Alaska Museum of the North, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the very first of the Museum Discovery Series. So Pat Druckenmiller is our curator of earth sciences and associate professor of geology. He is got his PhD in 2006 from the University of Calgary. He came to UAF in 2007. And since he's come here, he has gone on many expeditions to Alaska sites. And the Museum of the North now has the largest collection of Alaskan polar dinosaurs in the world, which is pretty impressive. So without further ado, Pat Druckenmiller.
Okay, I'm going to go, I've got a wire on me here. I hope you can all hear me all right. Is that volume okay? Good, thumbs up. Great, thank you. Thank you, Aldona, and thank you for joining us for the inaugural run of our Discovery Series. And as Aldona mentioned, we are going to try to liven things up a bit and make it a little bit less of a lecture and more of a presentation of various sorts. So I've got a couple of things in store for you, and we just hope they all work. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into slides here, and there we go. My job tonight basically is to tell you a little bit about the fun things I get to do for a living, which is I get to study dinosaurs, I get to study marine reptiles, and other evidence of past life in Alaska. So I basically have this entire state as my playground. In the last couple of years, we've been doing a lot of field work across the state, and we have been making some really, really cool discoveries, things that have really opened our eyes about what was going on here during the age of dinosaurs, between, say, 70 million years ago and even as much as 150 million years ago. So I'm going to give you really the briefest of highlights about some of the work that we've been doing, some of the things we've found. Some of these things are published. Some of these things actually are in the process of being published. And all of this, I might add, is sort of a quick and dirty excuse as a preview for an exhibit that we're going to be opening up in May of this year. But more on that in a second. Let me first start by giving a little bit of a thank you at the beginning here, because there's no way I can, this is an incomplete list, I'll just tell you that straight out. I've got a lot of important names up here of people who have been involved in the museum work for, say, the last 7 years, but of course there's even a longer list from my predecessor, Roland Gangloff, and his associates before this. All of these people, though, have made possible collections, field work of dinosaurs all across the state of Alaska, and not just dinosaurs, but all sorts of fossils. I would like to take special, just highlight out a couple of people real quick. First of all, Kevin May, who's hiding in the back there. Kevin May deserves special credit. He's actually been really a co-leader, co-developer, and a co-leader of almost all the expeditions that I'm going to be describing to you tonight. So he's really a pivotal person, and frankly doesn't get nearly as much credit as he deserves for his work. He's probably single-handedly collected more dinosaurs in the state of Alaska than any person, I would imagine. And also I'd like to give a special thanks to Julie Rousseau, who's the collection manager for Earth Sciences. She's actually, I especially want to give her a public thank you because sadly she's leaving to go off onto other adventures very soon. She'll be sorely missed here, but she's been a great collection manager and also involved in so many of the different aspects of the department and field work. And also thank you very much to a lot of federal and state agencies who have helped us accommodate our work in various ways. Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service. Again, I can't really get to list all of them individually, but thank you to you all. As I mentioned, we're going to start, actually we're in the process right now of putting together a dinosaur exhibit. This will be the first Alaskan dinosaur exhibit we've ever really had in the state. It's going to highlight a lot of the things that I'm talking about tonight. It's going to include real fossils, it's going to include casts, it's going to include skeletal mounts of dinosaurs. It's going to tell about the world that the dinosaurs lived in. All of this will be opening up in the middle of May. May 23rd is the official opening date for this exhibit. We have a lot of work to do before then, but it should be pretty cool. So I'm going to give you a few little teasers tonight of things that you'll actually see in that exhibit. Okay, so let me start by just giving you a little bit of a background on where we actually find dinosaurs in Alaska. And the quick and the dirty answer to that question is pretty much everywhere. Dinosaurs are found across the state of Alaska in many different places. And most of them come from two geologic periods, the Jurassic and the Cretaceous. In fact, almost all of them are from the Cretaceous. But I'm just going to highlight a few of the major sites right here. And I'll begin with mentioning one of the sites on the Alaska Peninsula. Yes, we have dinosaurs way the heck out on the Alaska Peninsula, out near Chignik and Aniakchak National Monument. We have dinosaurs from the Talkeetna Mountains. These are dinosaur both bones and tracks that we've been finding in those areas. Denali National Park and Preserve, just of course our neighbor. World-class set of fossils that have been found in recent years and worked on, just really a small distance away from the museum here. Yukon River, very recent discovery that we made just a couple of years ago. Turns out it's on a scale comparable with what we see in Denali National Park. And the North Slope, along the Colville River in particular, is probably the, I guess you could say, ground zero for dinosaurs in Alaska. And this is actually where most of the dinosaur bone material that we find in the state comes from. So we'll be talking especially about this. We've been doing a lot of work up there for a long time. And in fact, to give you sort of a taste of Alaskan prehistory, I'm going to cover these three sites that are boxed in red letters as examples of the kinds of dinosaurs we find through different geologic periods. And they also happen to nicely cover three very different parts of the state. So I'm going to start with talking about the Black Lake Tracks. And these are actually Jurassic in age. So quick little backup, and we're going to talk geologic time very briefly. Here is one person's take on geologic time, and of course this is Ray Troll. I'm going to talk more about Ray in a bit because part of this program is going to highlight the efforts of artists and what they do to bring to life the science that we study. And Ray Troll has this very nicely color coordinated, and this is actually accurately color coordinated. There are colors for these geologic periods. There's official colors. He's sort of given us a very good sense of his view of the last 540 million years of Earth history, starting from the Paleozoic and up in particular. And the period, the window of time we're going to talk about tonight is the Mesozoic. It literally means middle life. This is the quote-unquote age of dinosaurs. And in Alaska, we actually have fossils of fossil vertebrates from the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous, the three big periods of the Mesozoic. We don't, however, have any Triassic dinosaurs. We do have Triassic marine reptiles, which are not dinosaurs. I'm not going to talk to you about those tonight, because if I did, we'd be here for a really long time. Instead, I'm going to tell you about the Black Lake site. This is the Dinosaur Tracks on the Alaska Peninsula. They are the only Jurassic dinosaur fossils in Alaska. Then I'm going to tell you about what we find on the Yukon River. These actually come from what we would call the middle of the Cretaceous, around 90 million years, possibly a little older, possibly a little younger. And I'm going to end with talking about the Colville River, and I'm going to actually end with a little bit of recent artwork that is derived from our work along the Colville River. So let's begin with the Jurassic. And let me begin with this photograph right here. When I started, my predecessor, Roland Gangloff, had accumulated some information on previous dinosaur finds in the state. And one of the things that I found in my files was this photograph, which was something that he had gotten from the Bristol Bay Native Corporation. And it's a photograph taken on some native land down on the Alaska Peninsula. And this photograph clearly shows some really interesting dinosaur footprints on this slab of rock. And this is a vertical slab of rock. So my first comment here, of course, is no, dinosaurs were not that agile. They weren't running up a vertical cliff. This was once horizontal, and mountain building events have basically scrunched it up vertically. So these dinosaur tracks were quite interesting. One of the interesting things about them was the little note on the back of this said it was either from Cretaceous or possibly Jurassic rocks. And that kind of made me excited, because if it was Jurassic, these would be the only Jurassic dinosaurs in Alaska. That's pretty cool. I was also intrigued because they looked like they were probably meat-eating dinosaurs, which tend to be rare. But there was a problem in that we didn't actually know where the heck this site was. And the Alaska Peninsula is kind of a big place. We had a rough idea, and actually we put together a team of people, including Paul McCarthy and Sarah Fohl from the Geology Department, Robert Blodgett, who's a geologist in Anchorage, and Kevin May and myself. And this is actually Sam Egley, who's a helicopter pilot. If you've ever flown out of King Salmon, you might have flown with Sam Egley. We put together our team, and we headed out to our site to see if we could find and locate this site. And as it turns out, fortunately, we got a hold of a guy in Hawaii who was involved in the original discovery in the 1970s. And I guess he's tired of Alaska. And he gave us a little bit more of a clue about where to go, but it was still a little vague. So we took off for the Alaska Peninsula, landed here at the Chignik International Airport, and that's the real sign. And then we hopped onto a helicopter and made our way into the mountains to investigate this field site. And we knew from the map that somewhere on this mountainside there were dinosaur tracks. Well, we like to hike, we like to explore. This was also a very berry, shall I say, berry area. Lots and lots of bears, but they were all very good. They left us alone. And in fact, the first valley we decided to go up, which we thought was our best candidate, did in fact turn out to be the valley where the dinosaur tracks were located. And in fact, here is what we found. So this was 2010, and it's a little hard to see because the light was coming kind of straight at me that day. But this is the bluff. This is the same cliff. That's the original photograph from 1975. And just to orient you, you might see these tracks right there are the same as those two tracks right there. What had changed, however, was half of this slab had actually slumped away. So we lost a whole bunch of tracks, which, that was too bad, but we were pretty happy to get what we got. So the next problem after we found it, that was exciting, was like, how the heck do we actually get to the sites physically to actually record data? And as you can kind of see here, these little blue dots, I'll explain that in a minute, those actually represent where some of the tracks are located, and it wasn't really easy to get to at all. Fortunately, we had brought climbing gear. Sarah Fohl's also quite a good climber. We got this rope set up, and we were able to sort of shimmy up the rope to actually access the site where we were able to get to the tracks. Once we actually got up on that rope, this is kind of a close-up view of what those tracks actually look like. So to explain, in fact, I have a exact replica right here of those same exact tracks that came off of that face. When you collect dinosaur fossils, you like to take the thing home with you. That wasn't really going to be an option in this case. So what we had to do instead is we use this fun stuff right here. It's called sill putty, and it's a two-part molding compound. And this is Kevin's arm down here, and he was mixing up the sill putty into a ball, and he was going, ready, 1, 2, 3, catch, and he'd whip it up to me, and I'd catch it, and it's soft and pliable, and then I would squeeze it in to each one of these individual footprints, and it sticks, and then it dries, and it's supposed to dry in an hour. In Southwest Alaska, it took 2 days. But they eventually did dry, and then we can peel these off. We can take this back, and then we can actually in more detail record very good data actually right off of the tracks themselves, or pour plaster on top of them, and voila, make a perfect replica. If I get the light just right there, you can kind of see the shadows there. So that is one of the ways we record data. What did we find? Well, one of the great things about having people like Sarah and Paul and Bob Blodgett along as geologists and invertebrate paleontologists, they helped answer a really important question. And that question was, how old are the rocks? What kind of environments were these rocks deposited in? And one of the important things we found out, these rocks are definitely in what's called the Naknek Formation. These rocks are definitely Jurassic in age. Because of that, we were able to actually find out that they occur at the very, very end of the Jurassic period. And in doing so, in recognizing this, we actually pushed, for sure, the fossil record of dinosaurs in Alaska back by 50 million years, just like that. So that was a really exciting thing to be able to know for sure. And to date, this is the only Jurassic dinosaur fossils we have and the oldest record for dinosaurs in Alaska. Another cool thing that we found out was about the dinosaurs themselves. And that included, I mentioned, trying to figure out who these track makers were. And when we got a good look at these, we were actually able to see some things that gave away their identity. All of the tracks are three-toed. All of the tracks have long, narrow toes, and some of them have even these little distinct little claw impressions. This is actually a cast of that exact footprint right here. You can see the nice little claw impression right there, a sharp, long claw. So yes, these are in fact meat-eating dinosaurs that made these tracks. In fact, they made several tracks, and they actually are trackways, multiple tracks in a row that can tell us interesting things about how fast they were walking as well. Another cool thing you can do with the dinosaur track is if you take a track like that and you measure it from the back of, I call it the heel, it's technically not a heel, it's the metatarsal pad, from the back of the foot to the end of the toe, that is about, in this case, 18 centimeters long. If you multiply 18 centimeters by 4.5, which is a good average of conversion here, it gives you, for small meat-eating dinosaurs, an approximation of the hip height of the animal. We now know dinosaurs didn't walk around like this, like you saw back in the old books, but they walked horizontally, so hip height is a pretty good measure of body size. So this animal had a hip height, well, not a whole lot different than mine, actually. So it wasn't a big meat-eating dinosaur particularly. And in fact, if I had to guess who it was, it's not possible often to say this species of dinosaur made that footprint. But what you can say is, at the time, we know there was a dinosaur, for example, called Ornitholestes, which is a small carnivore that was running around North America at the time, which could have been something like what the track maker was. So I'm not saying it was, but it was something like this that was running around Alaska. Okay, so you're probably starting to get the hint now. You can get a lot of good information from tracks. In fact, dinosaur tracks are really valuable pieces of information for us because, if you think about it, one dinosaur, when it dies, it leaves behind, if you're lucky, 250 bones, something like that. But one dinosaur in the course of its lifetime might leave behind millions of footprints. So if you want to learn about dinosaurs, footprints are really great ways to do it. They tell you things sometimes that bones cannot. So dinosaur tracks are not second-class fossils. They're really, really important information. And in 2013, we made a discovery along the Yukon River of one of Alaska's biggest dinosaur track sites. That's kind of on par with what we're seeing down in Denali National Park. This great little map, this is a geologic map. This is kind of my quick and dirty way of answering the question on your mind is, why did you decide to go look for dinosaurs along the Yukon River? Because, it's a good question, because no one's ever found dinosaur tracks on the Yukon River before, at least not down in this area of the state. So, yeah, why bother going? Well, one of the things, this is something that Kevin and I would sit around and talk about, and when you look at a map like this, and it's a little hard to see with this coloring, but this light shade of green represents a particular rock of a particular age deposited in a particular environment. It's Cretaceous rock that was deposited right along the margin of a coastline or in floodplain in valleys, basically. In other words, every color on this map represents a different rock of a different period of time. And that is really the quick and dirty answer of how we decide where to go find fossils, because we want to look for rocks that were formed when dinosaurs were alive. These green rocks indicate they were in the Cretaceous period. Remember green, green is good. And these particular rocks were also mapped as being deposited in environments where you'd expect dinosaurs to live. It's that simple. You find a geologic map. This is the first clue in how you go out finding dinosaurs. So we said, hey, this looks great. The literature seemed to suggest that there were a lot of plant fossils down there. Plant fossils are often found in association with dinosaur tracks. There's some coal. Bingo, let's go. So we hopped in the boat in Fairbanks and went down the Tanana, down past Galena, and actually we were working in this area, sort of in the Galena area, did a little 500-mile float trip, and along the way, we found dinosaur tracks. This is how we got around, good old-fashioned boats. We have what's called the dino barge here. We have a couple of Zodiacs with 30-horse outboards to keep ourselves moving. We have a lot of gear. We have a couple of soar rafts there that we use to put a lot of our equipment in. And we make our way downriver. This is a pretty typical outcrop down in that neck of the woods. These rocks are the Cretaceous rocks that should ideally have the dinosaur tracks. And when we got out and started to walk these beaches, we found the tracks all over the place. Do you see the track on that one? Right there, if you haven't seen it. Sometimes they're kind of obvious. This was probably the most obvious track. This was actually found by Steve Boutte, who's the works in the exhibits department here at the museum, who was also along, found this spectacular dinosaur footprint. In fact, we have a cast of it right here because we put some sill putty on it right away when we found it. So there's a cast of that footprint. In some beaches, we got out and we would find literally hundreds of footprints. This little pile of 50 footprints was found in about 10 minutes. So the question is, why the heck didn't anybody see these before? Well, before I answer that question, I'm going to go off onto a little tangent of a video. So I thought I'd give you first a little taste of what life is like cruising down the Yukon River. These are the videos you're going to see here were made by Kevin May. So this is pretty typically what we'd spend our days doing, and getting 500 miles down the river. We spent a lot of time doing this. Outcrop to outcrop to outcrop. Piled up, there's Paul McCarthy over there. One of the cool little techniques we used to actually look at the rocks that were higher up on the cliffs that we didn't really want to walk on are little quadcopter or little drones. And Kevin hooked up a GoPro to this quadcopter to give some really spectacular views of outcrops that you don't normally get. And they give you just some really great footage too. They sound a little bit like mosquitoes, but we had a lot of those. This was 2013. You might remember that was a great summer for bugs. Some of the tracks that we found we wanted to bring them home, obviously, but they were in a slab of rock that was a little thicker than we liked, so we could trim them off before we brought them home. This is, in fact, that really amazing meat-eating dinosaur footprint that I showed you earlier. You can't really saw all the way through it, so we'd score the edge all the way around, and then we'd go in with hammers and chisels and basically start to try to wedge the slab apart without breaking it, which in this case, fortunately, worked out very well. It's Megan Shea, undergraduate student here. Oh, there it goes. That's the sound we wanted. One last little tap for good luck. There we go. Ready? Ta-da. And that's the way it's supposed to work. It doesn't always work that way, but we don't show you that video, do we? Another view of what our camps are like. This last summer, none of these None of these beaches existed. The water level was too high. It was camping in the willows. Here we go. All right, back to some slides. Da-da-da. Where were we? Oh, yes. So I'm going to answer that question again. Why the heck did nobody find these tracks? And this has a lot to do with really one thing. And that one thing is, in the word, preservation. And if you might have noticed, these probably don't jump out at you as being dinosaur tracks right away. And the reason for that is because when we make a footprint in the mud somewhere, you know, we make something like that. We make an indentation into the ground. We make a negative imprint, what's called the true track. More often than not, what we find is not the true track, but actually the sediment that filled in the true track. In other words, a natural cast. And to illustrate how that's done, I thought we would actually show you how a natural cast is made. And to do this, I need a volunteer. I see a hand up back there. Yeah? All right, come on down. Good, all right. You don't mind getting your feet wet, I hope. So what we're going to do is we have, to make this really accurate, what we have here, go ahead and slip your one shoe and one sock off, preferably on the same foot. So what we have here is actually some fine-grained sand. This is actually good. This is basically was rock when we collected it, and we've sort of digested it a bit and softened it up. So this is actually Cretaceous sediment, and it's wet. So you're going to pretend you're a dinosaur, and you're going to come over here. And so all we've done is we've taken this old sediment and we've soaked it in water, and you can see it's kind of a little soupy. So go ahead and put your weight on that and give it a good compression with your foot. Oh yeah, good. Now kind of jump on that. Nice, yeah. You can curl your toes if you want. Pretend you got claws. There you go. Ooh, good. It's just like walking on the beach. You didn't think you were going to do that tonight, did you? Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's try that. So pull your foot out gently. And okay, so we've got a pretty nice, pretty reasonable footprint here. Oh, it's got a little bit of water in there. I think, can you all see that there's a pretty nice footprint? Okay, good. All right. Now, you get to put your foot in there and rinse off. And we even were nice enough to bring a towel. Actually, that was Julie. She did that. I wasn't going to bring a towel, but What's your name?
Jessica.
Jessica. Thank you, Jessica. Yay. AKA Vanna. Now, here you have a dinosaur footprint laying out on some floodplain 90 million years ago. Many of the footprints that we find on the Yukon River were actually made into mud or some very fine-grained sand. Then, sometimes, a flooding event might occur. A levee will break along the edge of a river. Sediment will spread out across the floodplain. And we're going to simulate that with some plaster right here. And when it flows out across the floodplain, if it's not too energetic, it will flow right here into any dinosaur tracks that might happen to be sitting out there. Voila la la. And it fills it up. Now, this might be about 40 minutes, so if you haven't got anything better to do. Oh, no, okay. This is where the cooking show, that's why I like to watch cooking shows. So, so now you kind of go, oh, I just happen to have one on the oven. So fast forward, and in fact, here's an experiment from earlier today. So this is the same thing here, the same sand, the same plaster, except we're going to take it out and hope it worked. So we're going to see if this plaster makes a really nice natural cast. it goes, comes right out. Voila. And that is a natural cast. Now, if I'm careful about this, and there in fact is the original Julie footprint right there, still somewhat preserved. And I can kind of brush some of this off without making too much of a mess. You better go see a doctor, Julie. Okay, so there it is. That is a natural cast. So imagine layers and layers of rocks along the Yukon River, layers of mud, layers of sand, layers of mud, layers of sand. That's what we look for, because those dinosaur prints were mostly in the mud, and the layer of sand above that probably has a whole bunch of natural casts of footprints, just like that. As those layers of sandstone weather out of the bluff, they come up, they weather out of the cliff, they tumble down to the bottom of the cliff. You find chunks of rocks, and they've got 3 toes. It's not a chunk of rock. I mean, it is, but it's a dinosaur footprint. So we find all sorts of really cool dinosaur footprints like that. Here are some actual examples from the Yukon River. So I don't think people saw these before because they were looking for something totally different. We don't think dinosaur tracks. We don't think natural cast. We think true track. And this is a dinosaur track that was originally like this in the ground, broke out of the cliff, and now we've got a really nice 1, 2, 3-toed dinosaur footprint from a plant-eating dinosaur. It's all about knowing what to look for. It's search image. And now you have a good search image, you can find these too. Just let me know. Okay. Here's another footprint. I'm going to explain this one a little bit more because it'll be easier to see on some other images. So here's the kind of critters we're finding. Oh, I explained this. I knew I was going to forget to do these slides. But you got the general idea. True tracks versus natural casts. Fill up the track with sand, flip it over, and voila. In fact, that actually is the track I just had in my hand. That was made by an animal, something like this. If you've ever heard of a iguanodon, it's a plant-eating dinosaur. We had critters quite a bit like that running around Alaska 90, 100 million years ago. They left behind probably millions of these nice 3-toed footprints, just like this one here. Sometimes this is relatively small. Remember, you can measure from the tip of the toe to that heel. Gives you a rough idea, if you multiply by 4.5 or so, gives you a rough idea of a hip height. That animal was, again, probably only about that high. But we have larger footprints that show that there were pretty good-sized dinosaurs like this running around. And you might notice that they also walk a little bit on their front toes. And we find footprints actually from the front arm, from the front legs as well, just like that. And I'll tell you, if I walked up to you on the street and I said, hey, look at this dinosaur track, you'd say, where did you escape from? Because that doesn't look like a dinosaur footprint. But when you see them in association with larger 3-toed tracks, when you see these consistently of the same size and shape, you know that that's actually a dinosaur footprint. Other cool critters. We used to have these kind of critters too, ankylosaurs. They were kind of like the armored tanks of the Cretaceous world. They have actually hind and forefeet that look quite different. The hind feet tend to be about as long as broad, kind of big and round. The front feet imprints tend to look more like this. They tend to be kind of more crescent shaped. They tend to be wider than long. And sometimes, typically, you see them with 5 toes. The hind foot has 4. We find cool meat-eating dinosaurs. I've already mentioned this guy. Some reasonably sized meat-eating dinosaur that made this print. These are pretty rare. That's the normal situation. Meat-eating dinosaurs are going to be rarer than plant-eating dinosaurs. You see the footprint there? Ta-da. There it is. Sometimes seeing a footprint in the field is just a matter of having the right light. And if you go out early in the day, late in the afternoon, or in this case in Alaska, like midnight. You get a little bit lower light, it gives you better, kind of makes those footprints pop out a little bit better. Here is a really interesting kind of meat-eating dinosaur that we found on the Yukon River this year. Anybody recognize these? This whole slab's covered in them. What does that look like? Chickens. They look like chickens. Yeah, that's right. They're birds. Birds are meat-eating dinosaurs. Trick question a little bit there. These are, in fact, bird prints. In fact, these are the oldest, for sure, bird prints in Alaska, fossil bird prints. There are bird prints in Denali National Park, but Denali National Park is about 70 million year old rock. This rock is 90 to 100 million years old, so considerably 30 million years older. And I'm not saying great blue herons were living in the Cretaceous in Alaska, but some kind of large bird, wading bird the size of a great blue heron was responsible for making tracks like that. And here we are using our sill putty, part A and part B, to make a peel of the slab. Here's a really bizarre footprint. I'm going to highlight it there. This looks, for all intents and purposes, like a meat-eating dinosaur, except it's got one problem. It's got 4 toes. We looked at this and thought maybe it was one footprint on another. It really does not look to be that way at all. It's a 4-toed meat-eating dinosaur. And that is really interesting. Oops, sorry, got ahead of myself. Thought you saw it. But a couple of years ago, footprints like this were found in Denali National Park, and these were interpreted to belong to a very bizarre group of meat-eating dinosaurs called therizinosaurs. These are strange because when you look at those hands, that's not made up. They look like Edward Scissorhands. These actually had very long sickle-like claws on their hands. They were also probably feathered. That's a whole other story. And although it belongs to the group of meat-eating dinosaurs, to make it even more bizarre, they were probably herbivores because they've got really strange teeth. So this very strange group of animals, we now have evidence from 2 places in 2 different periods of time that may have existed in Alaska. Very strange. And last but not least, in the strange department, were these footprints that Paul McCarthy's pointing out right here. There I'm highlighting them a little bit better. This was actually a slab of rock that had a trackway of them. Here's one loose slab, and I'm going to highlight, there's actually 2 footprints here. There's a bigger one from the hind and one from the fore. Our best interpretation for this is that this is a sauropod dinosaur. One of these long-necked, long-tailed, herbivorous dinosaurs that are best known from like the Jurassic period, but in fact were around through the Cretaceous. And we believe this is the first record of this group of dinosaurs in the state of Alaska. And we found multiple tracks now like this. It's kind of hard to explain it any other way. So, there you have it. Sauropods in Alaska, who knew? Well, let me finish my little grand tour here of Alaska with a trip down the Colville River. The Colville River on the north slope, and these rocks exposed along the Colville River, which is called the Prince Creek Formation, absolutely, without a doubt, the best place in the world to find polar dinosaurs. And not just in Alaska, not just in North America, not just in the northern hemisphere, but in the world. Pound for pound, there are more bones and tracks that come out of these rocks that tell us about what dinosaurs were doing at high latitudes during the age of dinosaurs than anywhere else on the planet. So it's a really neat place to work. It's also a hard place to work, and your fossil finds can be very hard won, but it's a pretty tremendous place. And our museum now has been collecting up there for over 20 years. And it's through those collections that we've amassed somewhere in the order of like 6,000 to 7,000 bones and other specimens of dinosaurs from this area. Pretty remarkable. One thing I haven't mentioned yet in the discussion of Alaska back in the age of dinosaurs is what Alaska looked like. And this is a good place to do this. And what I'm going to describe here is true for what the world kind of looked like during the time that those rocks that were laid down in the Yukon River area were being deposited, as well as the rocks up on the north slope. Not so true for the Jurassic. But essentially, imagine North America 70 million years ago, and a very strange thing was going on. There was a sea, a shallow seaway, probably less than 1,000 feet deep at the most, that split North America into two kind of isolated land masses. One's called Appalachia, the other is called Laramidia. Alaska, at that time, way up here, was in the process of being formed. That's a whole nother story, but Alaska really was born through a long geologic process of addition of what we call these exotic terrains of rock that got slammed up against the margin of North America and actually smeared up the coast even. But probably around 70 million years ago, this is a very rough idea of what it looked like. Here's the very strange thing about living in Alaska in the Cretaceous, though, is it was actually farther north than it is today. And based on the best estimates possible, the Arctic Circle was probably, well, quite a ways south of Alaska even, what Alaska was at the time. And the north slope, the rocks that we find our dinosaurs in up there, were estimated to be laid down at a time when Alaska was as far as anywhere from like 75 to as much as 85 degrees north. Today, Barrow, Alaska, up at the tip, is at 71 degrees. So in other words, Alaska and that area was either a bit or quite a bit farther north than it is today. Having said that, it raises the next obvious question, well, how cold was it? Well, in this case, I'm going to tell you how warm it was, because the Cretaceous, and in fact most of the Mesozoic, was a time of global warmth. And so here's a quick quiz question. Anybody know what what we call the mean annual temperature, or the average yearly temperature of Fairbanks, Alaska is?
25 degrees Fahrenheit.
25, okay, very close. 27, in fact, I saw last year's numbers in the paper the other day, and it was 31.4 or something like that. In other words, it's getting warmer, yes. We'll call it 27. That's why we have permafrost, right? Because in other words, the average annual temperature doesn't actually get above the freezing point. How about Juneau, Alaska? It's going to be warmer. 41 degrees. This is all Fahrenheit. And a cool 10 degrees in Barrow, Alaska today. Now, 100 million years ago, in the middle of the Cretaceous, we had dinosaurs up in Alaska in that area. The temperature, based on the evidence we get from fossil plants, which are basically paleothermometers, it has to do with what we find in their leaf shape. It's another long story. Provides some clues to suggest that the temperature, average temperature in northern Alaska at those high latitudes was more than 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Things cooled off by the end of the Cretaceous, 70 million years ago, to somewhere actually very close to what we see today in Juneau. So in fact, we had a pretty strange environment. We had, because of this warmth at high latitudes, we had forests. Yes, forest. And here's the evidence. We're floating down the Colville River, and here is a log, a petrified log. That's a foot in diameter. Here's a log that's actually still in place in the rocks. There were forests on the north slope. It was a warm place, but it was so far north, it was also seasonally a very dark place. And Ray Troll, this is a yet unpublished image that Ray shared with me of his view of way up north in the polar forest. His take on some of the dinosaurs that were running around the north slope 70 million years ago. Well, we've been up there again many summers. Last summer was probably one of our best summers ever in terms of what we found. We found all sorts of great stuff. Many of the things that we find are big bones. We find dinosaur bones from a variety of different animals I'm going to highlight here in just a second. This is, for example, a pelvic bone from a duck-billed dinosaur. We have a really great site we're working on right now that's actually halfway up the side of a cliff. That makes things a little more interesting, but hey, we're all up for a challenge. So big bones, we get those, yes, but I wanted to highlight some of the little things we find too, because finding fossils isn't always a matter of digging a big bone out, even for dinosaurs. Sometimes it's a matter of looking at the details. And to do that, we actually have to sometimes get evidence for dinosaurs only on the basis of their teeth. And there's a couple of sites up there. This is one site called Pediomus Point, where what we actually look for are old river channels that were channels when these rivers were flowing across this landscape 70 million years ago. Dinosaurs die, and the hardest thing in their body is their teeth. And their teeth actually, like the bones disappear, but the teeth actually survive. And they can actually get concentrated at the bottoms of channels of streams. We call them lag deposits. And we look for these channels in the rocks as we float down the river. And when we see what we think is a probable channel, we get out and we look to see if we can see any little bones, any little teeth. And actually, we look for this. This is the good stuff right there. I know, it doesn't look like much. There's my finger. This is kind of like a gravelly sediment. And it's in that you can find teeth. But you have to dig literally tons of it out and screen it and sift it and pick through it. And it takes a lot of time to do this. But we're getting new dinosaur species out of this work. Case in point, here are some of the teeth that we found on the North Slope. So first of all, notice the scale bar. Here are some crazy new dinosaurs that we're starting to see up there. Some are not necessarily, some are new and some are things we'd also known in the past. But here's a tiny little meat-eating dinosaur called Ricardoestesia. Very strange tooth. Atrociraptor. This is basically a North American version of Velociraptor made famous in Jurassic Park, which is actually only that big. Troodon, a more or less human-sized meat-eating dinosaur, and one called Dromaeosaurus. We actually have 7 different species of meat-eating dinosaurs from the North Slope, and all but one of them pretty much are known just on the basis of teeth alone. These teeth are really important. This is the one animal we do know of a little bit more than just the teeth, but only a tiny bit more than just the teeth. This was recently named, this is a tyrannosaurid named Nanuqsaurus this last year. And this is the tooth in comparison, size comparison. And if I held that tooth up against a T-Rex tooth, which is a kind of a close relative, that Nanuqsaurus tooth is even quite a bit smaller than this. So this is Tyrannosaurus rex, and we don't have Tyrannosaurus rex in Alaska. So just to give you an idea of the average meat-eating dinosaur that we have evidence for in the North Slope, human-sized or less, little guys, several species, pretty cool. Here's another one we found recently. Anybody want to guess what these are teeth of? Put you on the spot again. Shark is a great, when I first saw these in collections, they were labeled chondrichthyes. In other words, sharks. They look like shark teeth. But the roots aren't right. And they've got these crazy enameled patterns, which sharks don't have. I got to give you a little hint here. There is a 1 millimeter scale bar. You could line up 18 of these teeth on one dime. They're birds. These are bird teeth. In the Cretaceous, in fact in the Jurassic, the first birds had teeth. And the first birds, actually there's flightless birds. This one's called Hesperornis. This is a flying bird called Ichthyornis. There are several different types, of course, of early birds that had teeth. And right now, the best record we have of these early birds in Alaska, besides footprints, are these teeth right here. A couple of different kinds, actually. But boy, did it take a lot of screening to find that. Other new dinosaur records from Alaska. This block of rock right here, which is very heavy, and you can come up and look at it later, was something that was found actually back in the 90s. And it wasn't actually found by our museum, but our museum was the repository for this specimen. When I got here and looked at it with one of my colleagues, Greg Erickson, we started to look at this and go, this is kind of weird looking. First of all, we had to figure out what it is. And what you're looking at here is actually a bone that's very, very incompletely preserved. It's mostly the impression of a bone in rock. And that bone is a maxilla. It's a bone from the cheek region right here of a duck-billed dinosaur. Actually, it's not this duck-billed dinosaur, but it's this bone right here that had separated from the rest of the skull. And in fact, there's part of the lower jaw with teeth and other parts that preserve the front part of a skull of a dinosaur. And what made us really interested about this is that this is a very distinctive bone on these groups of duck-billed dinosaurs. And that particular shape belongs to one specific group called Lambiosaurs. These are duck-billed dinosaurs that have big, giant crests on the head. So these are a group of duck-billed dinosaurs are some of the most common dinosaurs we know of. They call them sometimes the cows of the Cretaceous. They were plant eaters. There were lots of them. They traveled in herds. They were big. They were up to 30 feet long. And they had these crazy grinding teeth for vegetation. And some of them had crests on their head, and some did not. And until this specimen, until we recognized what this is actually the first record of a Lambiosaur in the state of Alaska. It's something new. We've actually got some really nice, very strange-looking teeth in there. And this specimen represents actually a new type of duck-billed dinosaur in Alaska. And interestingly enough, a couple of years ago, Ray Troll, the artist I've mentioned before, decided to come along on a little trip with us up to the North Slope. And he was out there, and we told him about all this cool stuff. And this is Ray on his bone bed. Yes, those are all pieces of bone, dinosaur bone, along the banks of the Colville River. And so he made a bed. That's Ray. He does that stuff. Ray's working on a book right now with another guy, Kirk Johnson, who's the director of the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. And they're going to write all about fossils in Alaska and the whole west coast of North America. That's a book that should come out in about 2 years. And he's doing new art. And I said, hey, Ray, you want to do some art on the North Slope? He said, you bet. So this is Ray Troll's take on our new Lambiosaur in a classic Ray style. So here's our duck-billed dinosaur. This crest shape is purely hypothetical. Needless to say, the colors are even more hypothetical. But he also highlighted a few other things that we do have other evidence for up on the slope. This is a strange group of what are called ostrich mimic dinosaurs or ornithomimosaurs. We actually have a bone or two of one of these guys in our collection. So we did publish a paper on these recently. We also have evidence for 2 different types of small plant-eating dinosaurs. We used to call them hypsilophodontids, but we don't call them that anymore. Anyway, we have 2 distinct species, including this is actually the smallest dinosaur in Alaska. And as an adult, it was probably only about that tall at its hips. We know it mostly from its teeth again. And I'm going to just finish up with one other kind of duck-billed dinosaur that actually is the best known dinosaur in Alaska. And this is a duck-billed dinosaur that comes from a particular layer of rock that's called the Liscombe bone bed, a layer of rock that was actually found in 1961 by a guy named Robert Liscombe, a geologist. He didn't know at the time he had found dinosaurs up there. He was mapping the rocks, looking for oil and stuff like that. We now recognize that the layer he found was this bone bed that contains hundreds of thousands of bones of an animal that looks, well, something like this, a duck-billed dinosaur. It's definitely, we know that they're duck-billed dinosaurs. We have in our collection like 6,000 bones that we've collected out of this bone bed. It's very prolific. Here are some of the bones right there. That's a femur, a big thigh bone. Here's another bone coming out right there. There's actually about 2 or 3 other bones. This is a very single most richest deposit of dinosaurs in Alaska. So we've excavated a lot. Here's some more. And there's been a question like, what is this thing? What kind of animal is this? And since people have been digging there, pretty much everyone said, well, it looks like this duck-billed dinosaur called Edmontosaurus, which is very well known from Montana, South Dakota, Alberta. In fact, there's 2 species of Edmontosaurus, and this is one artist's rendition of that. So people said, I think this is Edmontosaurus, but we didn't know for sure if it was Edmontosaurus. And there's a good reason for that, is because this is a reconstructed skull of our Alaskan duck-billed dinosaur. And here's an adult regular-sized Edmontosaurus for scale. In other words, what I'm telling you is almost all of the material we get out of that bone bed is from juveniles. And that's cool, but it's also a problem because juveniles do not display, they have not yet developed the features that make species distinctive. So when you see differences in a juvenile like this compared to an adult, you can either say, well, they're different because they're actually different species, or you can say they're different just because this one hasn't grown up yet.
How do you know it's juvenile?
How do we know it's juvenile? We actually have adult-sized material of this animal as well, just not as much. The vast majority of it's juvenile, but that's a good question. So our problem has been figuring out whether or not this is a juvenile of a known species or a new species. And my PhD student, Hiro Mori, who graduated last year, actually what he did, this was his project, figure that out. And Hiro spent a lot of time doing that, and I won't get into all the details, but what we basically figured out was we were able to tease apart the differences in the growth of juvenile duck-billed dinosaurs, especially these juveniles of this species. We were able to learn about what their growth trajectories were like, to find out whether differences we see with an adult are also seen in juveniles. And to make a long story short, based on that and the preservation of adult-sized material we have in our formation in Alaska, we were able to very definitely say this is not Edmontosaurus. And in fact, this is a new species. This makes that kind of a lot more exciting. And I know everybody wants to have a new species, but really, when you do the work on this, it was pretty clear. This is a definitely unlike any other duck-billed dinosaur known anywhere in the world. We are, that paper has been submitted. It's going through the review process right now, and good old academia takes forever. But it was cool enough to say, hey, we should mount some skeletons of this thing as part of our new dinosaur exhibit. So much of the new dinosaur exhibit will be occupying the temporary gallery space that the Sikuliak exhibit's in now. But we're also going to mount 3 skeletons of this new juveniles of this new duck-billed dinosaur species. That's being done right now. These are, this is a digital mock-up, so you're not going to see it when you walk out the door. But I did ask one of the artists in Alaska if he'd be interested in painting what this animal actually looked like in real life. So over the course of the summer, I've been consulting with this artist whose name's James Havens, who works out of Anchorage. He was very eager to take on this job of painting a lifelike reconstruction of what the new Alaskan species looks like. And so at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to close my computer, going to walk over here, and I'm going to unveil to you, for the public, for the first time, what this painting looks like. And as we do this, there should be some nice lights coming on. So as you can see, it's kind of a big painting. This is an 11 by 16 foot oil that he worked on. It took him basically 3 months to paint this. And as we worked together on this, he made sure he tried to do his darndest to get as many accurate details of this painting as possible. This painting will actually be the backdrop to the skeletal mounts on the wall outside in the gallery. And just wanted to point a couple of things out here. You can sort of see the stretcher boards that he had. That's the crease that you see. That was the board, the frame it was mounted on while it was painted. You might notice, first example, things to do with the skin. We actually have skin impressions of dinosaurs from northern Alaska. So that skin texture, which took a long time, was based on actual skin impressions from these species of dinosaurs. The details actually can't see very well with this pointer, but you can with this one. The details here on the foot, for example, nicely mimic, very, very closely mimic the footprints that we find up on the Colville River as well. These are the juveniles compared in size to the adults. So in other words, our little juvenile duck-billed dinosaurs, they're probably only about 8 feet long and only about this tall at the hips. An adult, based on some of the bones we have found, probably around 25 feet long. So big animals. This patterning of little frill on the back, we don't actually have direct evidence of that here, but we do have other fossils from similar species in Montana that have that pattern. Some of this is a little bit conjectural. You might notice some coloration. on the head region. Many dinosaurs clearly had some features that were basically there for showing off. So sometimes they're expressed in the form of those big crests I showed you earlier on their heads. Sometimes it probably had to do just with coloration. We don't preserve the color, but that's a little bit of artistic license. What else? The vegetation, for example. The vegetation here is all based on fossils of plants that we find on the North Slope. An understory of ferns and horsetails, actually quite common. We find those fairly frequently as fossils. And right here, these leaves, there are broadleaf plants, small trees and shrubs that had broad leaves. And what you find in high latitudes typically are those leaves are almost invariably serrated edge. They have like a toothed margin. And so these all, he painted on nice little toothed margins on every one of those leaves. They're not smooth because we wouldn't have had those. This particular larger conifer right here is a thing called Metasequoia. That was also found here. And if you look for some fun little details, right there are two birds. And we have footprints and teeth of these birds. So a lot of effort and time went into this. A couple of other quick things. The backdrop there represents the Brooks Range. The Brooks Range was in the process of being uplifted at the time. It's a little hard to guess exactly how high it was, how much expression on the landscape, but it was definitely a mountainous region. And then overhead, because these were at high latitudes, the Northern Lights. So a lot of work went into this, and this will be again on permanent display in the lobby starting on May 23rd when we open our new exhibit. With that, I'm going to shut up, and I'll open it up for any questions that you might have. Yes?
I recall the military helped to airlift the fossils out of the Colville, and I was wondering which one that was.
He's asking about an airlift, the military helping us airlift a fossil out of the Colville. They did a couple of things. They helped with the removal of a large ichthyosaur that was found in the Brooks Range in 2002. And they flew a couple of big Chinooks up to get that ichthyosaur out of the ground, a big giant marine reptile. Kevin, correct me if I'm not wrong, but they did do a trip up on the Colville once too.
They hauled David Norton's boat up there.
Oh, there we go, Dave. Yes?
Does Southeast Alaska hold any potential for dinosaurs?
Does Southeast Alaska hold potential for dinosaurs? Possibly. Most of the rock down there that's Mesozoic is Triassic. First dinosaurs showed up in the late part of the Triassic. So the rocks aren't really the right age, and they're almost all marine. So they're all laid down in, under the ocean. So they don't tend to make great places to find or expect to find dinosaurs. There are a few pockets of younger rocks there from the Jurassic and Cretaceous and even younger than that might potentially have material, but we haven't found any dinosaurs in Southeast. But we have found some really great Triassic marine reptiles, including ichthyosaurs and thalattosaurs. And don't get me started. Yes?
In the, was it Black Lake?
Black Lake, yes.
Is there any reason to think that the tracks would be layered into the hill that's still there?
Oh, yeah. She's asking if those tracks would have continued into the hill. Absolutely. And, it's one of the things about these sites. We could go back again, and I'll tell you why we need to go back in just a second. Go back again 10 years later, and another slump of rock comes off, and it exposes a beautiful outcrop with more dinosaur tracks. That's entire, and I'm sure that those hills, if we just could strip them down to the right layer, they would be there. One of the things we found out from the geology was that most of those rocks were laid down underwater, so they're not good dinosaur place. But just in places where they basically were occurring on more of like a beach environment, that's where we find the tracks. But it was a fairly narrow window of rocks. And the reason we want to go back is we do have some exciting new discoveries from that area as well that we need to get back and find, that we found tantalizing bits of. But that's about all I'll say for now. Yeah?
Have any dinosaur fossils been found anywhere within the Kuskokwim River drainage?
Question is, have there been any dinosaurs in the Kuskokwim drainage? We went looking for them two years ago? Two falls ago we went up looking on the Kuskokwim because the right rocks are there. And we weren't able to find any, mostly because the water level was really high. We couldn't get up into the places we wanted to go, but we do have some places picked out down in that Kuskokwim area that we want to go investigate. I feel it's very likely there will be tracks there.
Just out of curiosity, where within that drainage?
Where we were near Crooked Creek in that general vicinity. Yeah. Yeah.
What about the Scammon Bay area, like Yaskinak Mountain? What kind of potential is there?
Scammon Bay, remind me again.
You know where Hooper Bay is? Just
Oh, yeah, Hooper Bay. Yeah, what do you think, Kevin?
I mean, it's not real well exposed rock.
Yeah, that's half the problem a lot of times is
there is some.
there's some.
Piney area towards Hooper Bay. Yeah.
One of the things you might have noticed on that map, geologic map I showed with the green bands of rock, there's a lot of it. And the rocks over by Unalakleet and south, there's a band of the right rock there. And depending how far south you go and whether or not there's actual outcrop, there's potential. There's potential. So I have no doubt that someday someone's going to bring in something and say, hey, is this good? And I'm going to go, oh, wow, yeah. Yes. Question?
So how do the true footprints get preserved?
So how to true proof it? Through the same mechanism. It has mostly to do on if a footprint's made in mud and it gets filled with sand, the mud is generally softer than the sand, so you preserve the cast. If the footprint's made in sand, and it's filled with mud, then it's the sand, the imprint, the surface that the imprint was made into, the sand tends to also preserve better. So it has to do with the lithology of the rock, whether it's sand or mud. Question in the back there. Alejo.
Have you ever found teeth inside dinosaur bones?
Ooh, teeth inside dinosaur bones. People have found teeth inside dinosaur bones, and they found things like chomp marks on bones. We haven't found any in Alaska, but we do have bite marks from things like Tyrannosaurs on the bones of things like our cute little new dinosaur species. So we know that they were actually eating them at times. So finding those grooves and bite marks are actually not that rare. Good question. Yeah. One more question. Yeah.
I've got a
Plant
plant question.
question. Okay.
Equisetum here. I know that Equisetum, and a lot of it at that time, was much larger, much higher. Do you have any evidence for higher or bigger Equisetum? They are in all the plants.
Yeah, Equisetum actually goes. It's much, much more ancient than this even. So some of the early Equisetum relatives, things like Calamites, had trunks like this big around, and I've collected those, but out of rocks from the Paleozoic, from like the Mississippian, the Pennsylvanian, 300 million year old rocks. Those were the big ones. We don't have any evidence of anything that size in the Cretaceous for those. I mean, there were some decent sized Equisetum relatives, but not quite on that scale. So yeah, I'll take one more. I don't want to.
Okay, what I don't understand is that if it's dark so much of the time because it's so far north, do these plants lose their leaves in the dark, or do they keep their leaves all year round?
Good question. She's asking about whether or not these plants would lose their leaves. And in fact, yeah, so there was an extremely seasonal light regime. 24 hours of darkness, and then winter was like 4 months of 24 hours of sunlight in the summer, 24 hours of darkness for months in the winter. So even these conifers lost their needles. So you might know today that things like the dawn redwood, Metasequoia, they still lose their needles. There's only one species left today, but these lost their needles in the winter months. And of course, these are broadleaf deciduous plants, and they lost their leaves as well. So yeah, they lost their leaves and needles during the winter months. So the question has been, yeah, the dinosaurs that were up there, what did they eat? What were they surviving on? This is a plant eater after all. So therein lies a very interesting question, and that's the basis for a lot of the research we're doing right now, is trying to address that. And just sort of very quickly, there's a couple of reasons we think that they didn't migrate, that they stayed put. One of the major ones being it's a really long way to get someplace south that's warmer and had adequate food. But remember, it is fairly warm. And dinosaurs have been pretty well demonstrated now to have an elevated body temperature and metabolism that could have kept them above. They weren't reptiles in their physiology, let's put it that way, not like a lizard. But at the same time, they probably weren't like a mammal, which means that they could have actually probably subsisted for long times at some sort of elevated metabolic rate, but not like a mammal. They don't have the same energy requirements. So they probably subsisted off really poor quality food, including we have fossil poo-poo, coprolites, from things like duck-billed dinosaurs, not in Alaska, but elsewhere. It shows that they were eating bark and twigs and branches. Just like a moose can subsist off of low quality forage in the winter, these guys probably did the same. And of course, if they were there, so were the meat eaters. So we think they were there year-round. Sure. Okay. One last question, then I'll let you go.
I'm going to pose a critical science question. If that's true, and there is a subdued metabolism going on, then that puts the predator at a disadvantage because it doesn't have the warm-blooded advantage of speed. And so there's something ecologically wrong with that argument, I think.
So you're saying that if we're assuming the theropods, the meat eaters, would have been of a similar physiology.
Yeah, maybe they had a different physiology to retain their ability to eat meat because they couldn't. If everything slows down, their predation's going to slow down, and what are they going to do in the winter?
Well, I'm not saying that they necessarily slowed down to such an extent that they basically were like,
Well, I know,
but I think they were keeping an.
advantage is advantage, and the advantage becomes less than the predation becomes.
Yeah, I think they kept enough of an elevated body metabolism that they were staying plenty warm. And they also were, I'll give you this other point too that's critical, is they were feathered. These meat-eating dinosaurs were feathered. They were probably maintaining quite a high level of metabolic rate. And these were definitely herding animals. And the theropods weren't behaving in this. They didn't have the advantage of living in a herd as the same way an herbivore would have. So I think probably some of the answer lies in there as well. But I'll just say that I'm happy to have you come up, look at the front desk or the things we have laid out here. Thank you again for coming. More Discovery Series talks to come.